Good morning. We are here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. My name is Laura Stoner, and I'm here with James Dyson. And it is August 23rd, 2023. And we are here to talk about your brother's service in Vietnam and your own experience during the Vietnam War era.
Okay.
So, why don't we start with you telling me your full name?
James S. Dyson, D-Y-S-O-N, native of Fredericksburg. Address for me now is 2037 Kings House Road, Silver Spring, Maryland, 20905,
Okay. So, what year were you born?
1942.
1942. And what were your parents' names?
Charles E. Dyson Sr. And Rosa White Dyson.
Mm-hmm. And what did they do for a living?
My father was a laborer, seventh grade dropout. Well,
Well, that's how far school probably went, right?
that time. And my mother was a teacher and a graduate of Virginia State Industrial School, I think it was called at the time. And she was the first certified high school teacher in Spotsylvania County.
Did she ever teach? We are doing an exhibit on Rosenwald schools.
Well, we had one,
You did? In
but it's gone.
Fredericksburg.
No, Spotsylvania.
Oh, in Spotsylvania.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they maybe had one in Fredericksburg, I'm not sure. You've seen one, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because I got some pictures of the ones down in Meadville on my camera. But yes, the Rosenwald School was maybe 5 miles from Miles.
Uh-huh. But did she have any involvement with it, or was
She taught at Rosenwald. We didn't attend Rosenwald because Rosenwald was essentially for people that couldn't get out of the community. It didn't have buses for black folks then, and if you were able to get to the school, it was either by grace of neighbor or someone would pick the kids up and take them to school. But at one point, it was a boarding school, so they would stay there until weekends and go home. But Rosenwald was sort of a neighborhood one. I think it was like 500 of them, I think maybe, in the country. It was founded by the Rosenwalds.
okay? And how many siblings did you have?
I'm the youngest of 8. One died before my birth, and there's 2 of us left now.
And what was school? So how was your schooling like as a child?
My school was great, because prior to entering formal education, my mother was a substitute, was a teacher, brother, and I used to go with her to the one-room schools where she was teaching, and she was teaching one-room schools until they consolidated the black schools in Spotsylvania County in 1952 by building a school for 1 to 11. We only had 11 grades, and so my education was great.
Did you feel like having a mother that was a teacher was an advantage for your family?
Not for my writing, no. I'm left-handed, only left-handed one. She was an excellent writer. My brother Charles was an excellent writer, but I never wasn't very good at it. And I think it was a problem they had with left-handed students because the desks were set up for right-handed kids, so that little thing was on the right-hand side where you, but on this side, there's nothing for, so we had to write over here.
And my dad's left-handed, and he kind
Yeah.
of writes like
Yeah, because
that.
the desk was on that side of the chair.
Yeah, that would be difficult to
Yeah.
do. So you said at one time that 5 of your brothers were in the military?
4. I'm the 5th
Okay,
surviving.
okay.
So yeah, my older brother was Navy, and fought in 1950. Charles, Sonny was Army, 53, I think, first time we went in. And JC was Jefferson, he was Navy. And my brother Frank, who's next to me, the only surviving sibling, was Army. And he was second lieutenant going in, having finished ROTC at Hampton. And he retired from the military as a major in the reserves, because after his tour, he got out and went into government and went back and was a reservist.
So you said that Sonny, he went to college
Right.
and was in ROTC.
No,
No, he, in,
Frank was ROTC. Sonny
Okay.
was college for 2 years and ran out of money and he left.
but he went to a black college,
He went to St. Paul, same one I went to.
St. Paul's,
Yeah.
but they ran out of money. But he had signed up, so when he got out of college, then did he get drafted or?
No, what happened, he ran out of money
Uh-huh.
and went to New York to he worked at Fisher Body, General Motors. And then he was drafted into the military, and that might have been 53, because I was in New York in school at the time. And then he was, when he left there, he went to the military. Came out of the military, I think, in 55. Went to Fredericksburg Police Department as first black. They were looking for a suitable black person,
As you said,
suitable person of color.
yes, that they didn't want him to do like hardcore policing.
Well,
he was kind of observing the community.
No,
No.
he had gun and a blackjack and all that, but he was restricted to one block in Fredericksburg. It was called the 500 block. It was a book, the Green Book,
Uh-huh.
that talks about the places that black folks were safe to visit when traveling around the country.
During segregation.
Yes. Fredericksburg at that time, there was A.P. Hill military base. There was Fort Belvoir Army. There was Quantico Marine. And of course, Blackstone had and all these guys came to town first of the month with money. And it was always a ruckus. And they were actually didn't want to send white cops down there because they could get hurt. So they put him down there. And they recruited him to patrol that block. And he was to arrest and keep black people in place, but not to arrest white people. And he got in trouble a couple of times because the white guys would come through the block throwing bottles at me and calling names, and he snatched a couple of them, and he was called in for that. So that was a problem. But the dichotomy is the blacks thought it was nice to have a black police officer,
Yeah.
but they thought because he was friends with them and had gone to school with them that he would give them leeway that cops didn't give. Weren't supposed to. That was his duty, to patrol and keep the place safe for citizens. And so they castigated him, really, because you can arrest us, but you don't bother the white guys coming through here doing all that stuff.
It didn't feel equal, that he had equal rights.
Sway didn't
Yeah.
have authority over.
He could not create safety from the white people the way like a regular police officer.
That's exactly right.
Uh-huh.
And he was not to bother white people. And they did some dastardly stuff in our block. But they'd ride through and throw stuff out the window and all that kind of stuff. And he stopped a couple of them and locked them up. Well, it took them up there, they didn't lock them up. He took them up and they let him go and started to lock him up for arresting him. And so...
But he owned a record store.
My cousin owned a soda shop. It was called a soda shop in the same block. This was called the 500 block. There was a hotel, black hotel at one end on the east side. There was a black motel. On the left-hand side,
Do you remember the name of it?
well, the Rappahannock was one. McGuire was the other. McGuire was the one on the right-hand side going north on for instance, Ann Street. The Rappahannock was the lower class one on the left-hand side going north. And next to that was the funeral home. Across the street was a black gas station and the pool hall and maybe 6 or 7 beer joints from one end of the block to the other.
And that was all to serve would you say that was kind of for the military community that
Well,
was coming?
that's where he came to town, you know.
Or was it the Fredericksburg black community?
It was black community, but when the military guys came to town, they came as a unit, sort of.
Uh-huh.
You know, they identified as bad boys, and nobody bothered them because they all defended each other, whether they knew each other or not. And so he was the only one down in that block to keep that place clean. You know, of course they didn't have cell phones at the time, and so there was no backup for him. You know.
But I mean, he had a daytime job. He had daytime jobs between his record shop and the soda shop that he bought from your cousin.
Yeah, he had duty from 7 at night until 3 in the morning, when all the joints closed. And he'd go home and rest, whatever. Then he'd come to Richmond to buy records for the record shop. The soda fountain he bought from my cousin was in the 500 block. Next door was a record shop. He bought a record shop next door. And so there was a door between the two places. And so, yes, when he got off from work, he'd go home and get a couple hours sleep. Then he'd have to come to Richmond because you'd go on Broad Street over here and buy those 45 records so at the time and take them back to set up a shop and buy food for his restaurant. And, yes, so he was.
He's burning the wick at both ends.
And then he also did the baseball team,
Uh-huh.
which was another tax on his time and energy.
So the baseball team was for black baseball, high school baseball players, right?
Well, when you finish high school, every community had a baseball team, but they were older guys and didn't want the younger guys playing with them. But the whites had the American Legion and the Stafford Braves, and they both were grounds from which pros came down to watch the white ball players. But there was nothing for blacks to do during the summer, the black kids. So his idea was to get an all-star team, the best from all the black schools, put them on the same team, and play ball. And that's what we did. You know, he recruited a bus, and Jim Haney gave him, the white establishment gave baseball uniforms. We're the only team that had baseball uniforms. And they were all high school kids. Now, we finished in school at 16. You know, so you out of school at 16, you graduate. I graduated at 16. And it was absolutely nothing to do, absolutely no jobs, because to work at the plant, which was the only indoor place for black folks to work, that was an accomplishment. But you had to be 18 to work there.
Yeah.
So the kids that got out of school when they were less than 18 worked at the lumber mill or on farms. They became 18, they may be lucky enough to get a job at the plant. But it was not much.
Yeah. Yeah, seems like a big problem that they wouldn't,
A big problem.
to occupy those kids for 2 years.
Yeah, no jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is all happening in like 64, 65?
No, 50.
50, okay.
50. So he finished school in 51 and went in the military in 54, maybe in 1954. Came back to Fredericksburg, became a policeman in 56.
Okay.
And stayed on the force for 2 years maybe. And then he left and went to teach at Boyd's Business School in D.C.
Okay, and what did he teach there?
Typing and business machine calculations and stuff like that. But he was the first black teacher there, and he appeared on the cover of Ebony magazine, which was the #1 black magazine in the country at the time.
So were the classes there segregated, or was
It was a white school. It was a white school.
it was a white school?
Yeah.
And he taught at the white.
He was first. It wasn't a high school. It was a business college.
Yeah, like an after.
It's a between college and typing in government. You know, that kind of thing.
Well, I'm sure there was a big demand at that time.
Oh, it was.
For that, that they say that in Northern Virginia, the government provided so many jobs to create kind of a middle-class black community. And so I'm sure there was big demand for training.
And typing was rising thing, to shorthand and typing. You know, if you could do either one of those things, you were better qualified.
So where did he learn to type?
What did he?
Uh-huh.
High school and college.
Okay.
In fact, the number one typer in the country was Cortez Peterson, and he had his own business college in D.C. And Sonny competed against him on several occasions in a match. Those old Royal typewriters.
Wow.
Yeah.
You don't think about that being a competitive thing.
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh. And then, so then after he teaches at the college, the typing
Right.
college.
Right.
Then what does he do?
After he left there, he went to Philadelphia for a while. He got married, and he must have lived in Philly a year before he went back to the military. He wasn't making any money in Philadelphia.
Okay.
He went back into the military
Mm-hmm.
in '61, I think. And he was stationed at Fort Bragg, Airborne 5th Special Forces in Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And I went down, stayed with him for 6 months, worked at PX. And then he was drafted to go back to go to San Domingo.
Uh-huh.
That was after '62 when James Meredith went to Ole Miss. And so he went to Ole Miss.
So is Meredith his wife?
No, he's the first black to integrate Oxford, Mississippi.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. That was after Faubus had stood in the door, I think, in Arkansas. But anyway, it was Oxford, Mississippi.
Uh-huh.
They sent Eisenhower, was it Eisenhower? Kennedy, no, Johnson maybe, that sent the troops in to escort Meredith into the school because the whites were attacking. They'd already done Central in Arkansas. I think it might have been 57, I can't remember. But the president sent these guys down, the airborne guys down to secure entry.
To kind of back them up.
Yeah, to back them up. And he was one of them.
Oh, okay. How did he tell you anything about how that experience was?
Well, he lost straight. He was a sergeant when he went down. He was private when he came back because of just certain things he didn't take, and some of it was superior officers denigrating black soldiers. See, and,
So it was within his own ranks. It wasn't just the people that were standing opposing the integration.
no, these military guys, white guys, military. And I don't know, you may not have seen the movie Soldier Story, but rank, there was equal rank didn't mean equal rights. So it's white sergeant, they had authority over black sergeant. And they did, but the white sergeant didn't have to obey. There were no sanctions for that. There were sanctions for failure to obey white sergeants, but not
It's okay, we can pause.
oh, yeah, so down there, it was a fracas, and he hit one of them in the head and lost the straight.
Oh, no.
And lost the straight. And so he had to gain that back. And so he went to flight school, to paratrooper school, and got his sergeant straight back. And by this time, it was San Domingo, Dominican Republic, rebellion down there. Trujillo had come in, to take over. It was supposed to make a democracy, and it didn't. They made it an autocracy essentially, and so they sent the troops in to preserve on behalf of the United States. This was right after the Cuban crisis.
Yeah.
Kennedy was in November '62. Kennedy was in office, and they did the blockade of the Russian. And the next year, I think it was San Domingo.
So he's
Johnson.
It's that theme that people are really concerned about the spread of communism.
Yes, and then that was after Kennedy was killed, and so the war had essentially the Vietnam War had been going on since 1955. The Indo-Chinese fighting each other, and then the South Vietnam was supposed to be of interest to the United States. North Vietnam was communist interest. And so by the time Johnson came in the office, the war was beginning and he ramped it up, sent more
Yeah.
troops in. And of course, that was part of his problem with the re-election. But there was anti-war sentiment by then
Yeah.
because the guys on the West Coast were, I mean, they were much more astute. We were reading the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Which is a very
Oh,
conservative.
No, if so now, you can imagine what it would have been then.
Yeah.
And so we didn't know a whole lot about Vietnam until I went to law school.
But okay, so your brother, I kind of want to follow your brother's trajectory and then we can talk
Okay.
about yours.
From there,
He went to San Domingo, and then
San Domingo,
and was that the first time he had left the United States?
that's,
First time he had left the country?
yeah, my other brother had been to Cuba.
Oh, okay.
The Navy brother, JC, had been to Cuba, Guantanamo, right after Castro, or before Castro. And this was the first time for Sonny to be out of the country, and it was in San Domingo. And that's where he was until he came home from San Domingo, and I guess within 6 months he was going to Vietnam.
Oh, okay. But like the military is his career now?
Yeah.
Okay.
When he went back in '61, he had decided to make it his career, because by that time he had 6, 7 years maybe. And he had decided to make it a career.
And he was still married?
Well, he had just gotten married because his baby, when he went to Vietnam, his one daughter was a year old. She was born in December, so she would have been a year and something old, and the other one was born in April, so she would have been 8 months old or something. There wasn't that much difference,
Yeah.
less than a year between them. And so they never knew the father.
Yeah.
No, they never knew him.
That's sad. So he comes back from San Domingo and then he gets sent to Vietnam.
Right.
And you said that chronologically, this isn't, we'll go back to you being at Howard, but you're in law school when he goes. And you
Right.
said that he came to visit you at law school
before
before he
leaving.
was moved out to Vietnam.
Before leaving for Vietnam.
Did he talk about how he felt about this conflict and like what it meant for him and his life?
Well, I think at the time he was still idealistic and gung ho. They didn't. In my heart, I believe they thought they couldn't die. They were so trained, and
And the U.S. was, a very big military presence. It was we had
everywhere.
not failed. We hadn't failed in a big way.
Yeah, that's right. And so I don't know if it was machismo or what, but he was prepared to go. Now the problem arose, as I told you before, that my friends in law school were anti-war, and they had come in from West Coast. They had seen the riots, they had seen the police in Watts beating people up, and in Berkeley beating people up. The Black Panther Party was just forming, and so the guys that came here were radical, and so they wanted to have a conversation with him, and this was my hope was that they wouldn't, because I was
You're afraid that they would clash.
yeah, and
But you were still proud of your brother.
oh
going to
yeah,
Vietnam.
he was my mentor. My father was 48 when I was born. My mother was 38. I'm the last of the oops. And so he was more contemporary with me because he and I were the last two home. So while he was on the force, he and I were only two at home. My other brother next to me was at Hampton in school. And so this guy, got my driver's license and all this stuff. He did all this stuff for me.
And you said that you traveled with him.
Yes.
When he was in a band.
Right.
Probably, was that during the soda shop record store time?
Yes. He was transitioning from soda shop record store and all that stuff. He, I got pictures over there, like that colored photograph that he began to produce dancers, brought in Lloyd Price and all these other.
He was a DJ.
No, no,
No,
he
no,
was just a manager.
Oh, okay, manager.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so he brought in all these guys, and they began to travel with James Brown and Donna Washington and Sonny and Joe and all those guys. And was called a Chitlin Circuit. And they'd go from Augusta, Georgia, where James Brown was from, to Maine. And all along the way, they'd play at bands and at juke joints and all the way up and down the road. And so they'd play all night until 2 o'clock in the morning, get a couple of hours sleep, and then we were on the road to the next town. And I was 16, I think.
So
Maybe 16, I think.
So
17.
you had graduated high school, but you were in that
Yeah,
period where,
no jobs.
yeah.
You know, and so one day he said to me, he said, you can't do this. You can't continue to do this because you got to find some other way to make a living. And so I want you to go to college. I said, I don't have grades for college. I don't have money for college. He said, that's okay. We'll go down to St. Paul where I went. And he took me down and walked in. The president, they remembered him because when he came to college, he was a farmer at home. And so St. Paul was producing its own meat and produce and all that stuff for students. And so he knew how to do the farm stuff. And so before classes, he'd be going across campus with a horse and buggy, hauling manure and stuff like that. And the president loved him because he had the tenacity and
Hard
to
work.
do it, just to get through school.
Yeah.
So when I got there, I had no money, and the president said, that's okay. He said, you bring him here on the 20th of January, and we'll get him in. And they did. And at that time, tuition was $750 or $375, I think, a semester, including food, room, and board, and several jobs, all on his on his credentials. Is how I got to school and how I finished.
Yeah. So you were able to finish there.
Oh yeah,
Uh-huh.
finished.
And what did you major in?
I had triple major,
Triple major.
psychology, sociology, and religion. And but my plans were to do nothing. I don't know what I was going to do because they were paying $2,300 a year for teachers in South Five, Virginia. They were paying $45 in Fredericksburg, $48 in Arlington, $100 a year. And so that didn't sound very attractive. And the guys in my class began to talk about what they planned to do. They were going to med schools and dental school. And I said, well, let me apply. And I applied to Howard dental school and law school. It was accepted both places. And because I had to take an inorganic chemistry or something during the summer in order to go to dental school, I couldn't afford to do that. So I took the law school. All I had to do was show up in September. So I went to law school instead. And,
How did your family feel about you getting into law school? Was that a big moment?
that was a tough one. My mother was 62, but she was sickly by then. And the idea was, my brother was the only one to finish college, the one that went to Hampton. At 61, he finished. But he went to military as an officer.
Okay, so which one went to?
Frank,
Okay.
the one next to me, the one's in California still surviving.
Uh-huh.
He went, and so the idea was that when you finish school, you help the ones behind you, like all the rest of them, sent money back home, like black folks did in those days. And the idea was that my brother who finished and now was a lieutenant would be able to help. But he messed around and got married in 62. So now my mother's home alone. My father died in 59. One sister's in Philadelphia, the other one's in Tokyo, or Japan, I believe, at the time.
Wait, a sister was in Japan?
Well, her husband was stationed in Okinawa.
Okay, okay.
So I think they had just gotten back from Germany in 57. My father died in November of 59 rather. And so now my mother's home alone. And I'm in school in Lawrenceville. And so on weekends, I'd thumb a ride and go up and hang out with, just so she wouldn't be alone. And So the idea was, I think, everybody expected, and I did too, to come out, teach, make my mother proud, and bring some money into the house. But when I got the scholarships, I went and I talked to my mother, you know, she said, look, if you had an opportunity for something like this, you got to take it. And I did. And regretfully, she died before I finished law school. And so she never saw any of the fruits of her investment in me, monetarily.
Yeah.
So no, I hadn't planned to go to law school. I don't know what I planned to do, actually. Had no plans.
Did you, once you got into law school, did you find that you enjoyed studying law?
I enjoyed law. You know, the problem is, my first semester there, he came by and then they left, went to Vietnam. He left in November to go to Vietnam. He was killed in January. So
So
was
you
in
left in November of 60.
65.
Uh-huh.
He left for Vietnam. He was, and he wrote all these letters home. Wrote to the newspaper saying, life won't be much for us here this Christmas, so pray for me and write me letters, stuff like that. Say, and if you read the headlines on that article there, they're playing for keeps. So my mother spent the whole Christmas holiday trying to reach him by phone. Now he's out in An Key somewhere north of Vietnam, and you don't carry phones around.
Yeah.
And so we thought it was kind of, didn't realize that it was her last gasp. And finally, she made contact with him over Christmas holiday. Don't know how she did it, or Red Cross or somebody got involved. And she did talk to him over the holiday. 23 days later, he was killed. January 23rd, I think it was, he was killed. He got home on February 3rd, I think. When they buried him on February 10th, she died on February 17th. I'm still a first year law student. My sister had a nervous breakdown. The one in Philadelphia had 3 kids, small kids, her husband working labor. And the one in my other sister had a nervous breakdown. Probably a month later, she had 4 kids at home, and her husband was in Vietnam. So here I am between law school and Spotsylvania one week, and for a couple of days helping these kids, and back to Philly the next week to help with those kids, to keep them out of trouble, to help the father and all. And so after that, the students took up, I wasn't going back to law school, but they took up a collection for me. And this is the first year I had just met these guys, probably 4 months before. They took up a big collection for me and presented it to me, and it inspired me to continue going.
Yeah.
And the dean told me, said, you can make up your courses. Yeah, you can make up your courses as you go along. So I stayed in school. Otherwise, I would have quit.
Yeah. So it was very tough on your family when your brother came home from Vietnam.
When he had a 1-year-old daughter and a 3-month-old or something like that. They're less than a year apart. And a wife with nothing, nowhere, no skills. And she had these 2 kids, and they were getting $200 or $300 a month or something. She had to leave Fort Bragg because you can't stay on post if your husband's dead.
Yeah.
So now she has to move back to Philadelphia with her people. And it was rough.
Yeah.
Well, the family was sort of disintegrated because she then connected to her family,
Yeah.
and her kids didn't know us.
Or her family was her lifeline.
It was her lifeline,
Yeah.
but her kids didn't even know we existed
Yeah.
until, I guess, they might have been 15 years old when they discovered that we existed, and they found us.
And you reconnected?
We reconnected, and now everywhere we go, they go.
Oh, that's,
Yeah. So I just called her a minute ago, asked her about her father's, dumbest thing I ever did. Asked her about her father's medals. She said, Uncle Jimmy, I was a year old when he died. I said, I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah, because her mother had all the medals. They don't know what happened to them.
oh, uh-huh. But how did you feel like the reception in your community was, like the war? I don't think that, there were demonstrations against the war happening, but, you know, it was kind of early in the American, like, moving a major troop presence in Vietnam when your brother died. Um,
It was 31% of the troops on ground were black. Population 12%. People killed were 24% black.
yeah,
It was the military was an escape route. Now, it was as you know, there was a draft going on, draft, and the only way you could choose where you wanted to go, if you go in the army, you're gonna fight. If you went to the Marines, you're gonna fight. If you went to the Navy, maybe not. If you went to the Air Force, probably not. And so the only choices you had would be to volunteer. And so people were, the kids with money, the white guys with money, could get deferments for school, and fathers on the draft board and all this stuff. And so in my community, white kids didn't go to the military.
yeah,
Yeah, they went to college. The black kids went to military. So if you didn't volunteer and go in one of the lesser services, Navy or Air Force, you'd end up getting drafted into the Army. Now, as far as I can remember, I was talking to my brother. He might have been the only black I knew from that spot, from Pennsylvania, to be killed in the war. Several lost limbs. But as far as I can remember, Sonny was the only black killed out of there. And he was the first native killed in the war in Vietnam.
so I meant like Spotsylvania community, like, were they supportive of your family because you had lost someone in the war?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. You know, my people came out of slavery in Caroline County, Spotsylvania, which is contiguous. And so we are probably related to 90% of the people there. My brother has done a genealogy, and we're related to the 90% of the people there, natives. Now, when I left, there were 13,000 people, and now there's 250,000.
Yeah, yeah.
But the originals, we were related to. And so, yeah, there were 12 black churches, and they all enacted that all the teachers were black. They all went to our church, the black churches. They stayed in their homes with black folks. And so families, black people were self-supported and really self-sustaining, because there was a store every other block, black folks sold candy, you know, and they had their own restaurants because we couldn't eat where white folks ate.
Yeah.
And so we were,
You formed your own community.
everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
And so,
What church did your family attend?
Savannah, we went to Savannah, and there were 11 churches other than Savannah in Spotsylvania County. There were 4 in Fredericksburg. And so, yes, everybody, and they remembered him from being a cop, and those who understood revered him. Those who understood, and the thugs and those who didn't were either in awe of him or disrespectful. But never had a problem.
Yeah.
Never in the community, because we were self-supporting.
So, do you know what he was doing when he died?
He was in combat. The article said that he was by enemy fire. He was leading a platoon into combat, and he was shot by automatic weapons. And when they brought his body home, they didn't want the casket opened. It was a glass seal. At the time, they thought that diseases would be brought in.
Oh.
And so the Army wanted the casket sealed. But we somehow persuaded it to put a glass top on so you could see where he was shot, right across here.
Because you felt like it was part of your religious rituals to view the body.
Well, we wanted people to see what happened. You know, Emmett Till, you maybe remember the Emmett Till story.
Yeah.
Maybe wanted people to see what had happened to her son. And we wanted people to see, because you gotta remember, we still we hadn't fully integrated Spotsylvania County. They had token integration. Just a few black girls were going to the high school, but they didn't have total integration until '68. My nieces were the first 3 blacks to go to white high school, and they let the girls go first, so the guys wouldn't be hitting on the white girls, and there wouldn't be a retaliation of guys fighting guys, and they did terrible things to the girls, but they survived, you know.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that they had to do that just to get education.
Yeah, and he'd been down to Arkansas, or Mississippi, trying to do, and he tried, we trying to do good things for everybody. And here, it was the same kind of element we have today, you know. But it's just that during that time, it was becoming more acceptable to be anti, you know, and a lot of people went to Canada.
Oh, okay, so you're talking about the anti-war.
Yeah. Protests.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So how did you understand the draft and your place in the draft?
Well, everybody had to register. So my idea was I wasn't going to register. And I wrote letters to the draft board. I was the last of 5 kids. All 4 had been in the military, and 1 had been killed. So I've not registered. So my cousin at the time was on the draft board in Spotsylvania, and they sent him to talk to me, and he said, "Jimmy, everybody must register. Now, if you don't register, it's a crime. If you're drafted and don't go in, that's a separate matter. But it may very well be that we can avoid having you go in." I said, okay. So I registered, and somebody classified me as 4F, which means that I would be the last one to go. You know, they would take the babies and old ladies before they take me.
But do you think that it was because I had heard that some people received deferments if a family member had died?
No.
No?
No, they wouldn't. And there was time that if you were the last surviving one that had, the only one that hadn't been, it was some nuance there, and that's the one I appealed to, but no,
Okay.
that didn't work. So I registered, and somebody got me classified as 4F.
So that wasn't like a concern in the back of your head that was coming?
Well, I wasn't going to the military.
Yeah.
I wasn't going, and that was a matter of anger. I wasn't going to do it, you know. He had been to Vietnam, he had done all this stuff, and he was still trying to sit at a lunch counter in Fredericksburg. No.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was in the civil rights movement in Lawrenceville, and if you remember the A&T guys, the sit-down protest in North Carolina in 1961, and we were still trying in Fredericksburg in 1960 to sit at the lunch counter. And you still got on the back of the bus when you're coming south from D.C. And then the Freedom Riders came through, but in '63 they killed the 3 voter registrators in Mississippi, and here he is in Santo Domingo, and they're killing Freedom Riders in Mississippi, and he's in Vietnam. No, that wouldn't happen. Not for me.
Yeah.
Wouldn't go.
Yeah. You're seeing what your country is going to offer you, the way they're treating you, and then you're seeing if you give your life the ultimate sacrifice, then yeah.
He had already been killed, and his kids can't do what he fought for America to be. No, it made no sense to me. You know, it was still lynching people.
Yeah.
You know, and so no, I wouldn't. Not inclined to go.
So what kind of activities because Lawrenceville is when you're at St. Paul's, right?
Right.
So what kind of civil rights activities are you guys participating in?
St. Paul?
Uh-huh.
St. Lawrenceville was 75% black, the Brunswick County. 75% black, not one black member on the board, council, city, anything else. Not one black person working in stores as a clerk. And that town was supported and sustained by St. Paul. and the 73% black folks who worked tobacco and sawmill. And they didn't realize that numbers meant something. So we organized, we had the NAACP, SNCC was out, and CORE, but we organized the NAACP in Lawrenceville, and we boycotted the town. We shut the town down. And from that, we got the first black clerk at the grocery store. It was Peoples, P-E-B-L-E-S was the name of the grocery store. Got the first black clerk. They had taken the stools up so we couldn't sit down. But when we boycotted, we went from church to church on Sunday. Secondary boycott was illegal, so you couldn't say don't shop here. But you could say shop where I shop, which is a little different. So every Sunday, we did these black churches, shop where I shop. And after about a year, like they did in the Montgomery boycott. After about a year of walking and suffering, black folks suffered. They had no cars to get places to get stuff. In Montgomery, they walked miles to work both ways. And they were afraid of the power structure because they had never been in a position of power in Brunswick. But once they realized that they had voting power that they were not exercising, because they had to count marbles before they could ascertain whether or not they fit to vote. Get so many marbles in the jar, that kind of thing. But once we started boycotting,
Using your economic power.
using economic power, and then they began to, the town died eventually. The town's dead now. But they began to be more vocal, got on boards, had black principals, black superintendent of school, all that stuff. But the economic base died.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah.
So you had done all of, but you said like Howard is radical compared to
Yes.
what you had
Yes.
experienced.
Yes.
Was it a different kind of protesting, would you say? Or was it, because you said that there was some reverse integration going on at Howard at this time?
What was happening is had been affirmative action to get black. I couldn't go to the University of Virginia law school because the government would pay for me to go out of state. They didn't want me to go to white law school. At Howard.
That's kind of a separate but equal kind of like vibe that Virginia is
that's
doing.
exactly, yeah. And so at Howard, it was the opposite. All the people coming in were black on scholarship, government money. So the government had Howard to institute affirmative action to bring in white students. And that's what the ones that came from Berkeley and UCLA and all those guys that came in on full scholarship. And so that's the way that worked. And so, but they brought in the radical ideas, like I was telling you, your senator here, or can't think of his name, he sat next to me in law school.
A U.S. senator.
No, your state senator.
Oh, state
He's the
senator.
head of the Senate, Richard Saslaw. Richard Saslaw. And one of the students there with him was Jay Green. He went by some Muslim name that used to fight with white guy that had a baby about a 16-year-old.
Joe Morrissey.
Yeah,
Joe Morrissey.
yeah. They used to have fights in court, physical fights in court. So, but all those connected, see, and Hill, Tucker, and Marsh were the black lawyers
Henry
here.
Marsh.
Henry Marsh,
And-
Hill, Tucker was one of the guys that did the Ludwig case, the miscegenation case in Virginia. So all those were the most prominent guys around.
And they were all at Howard.
They were all affiliated with Howard. Now Tucker didn't go to law school. Tucker studied and took the bar.
He read the letters.
Huh?
He did the thing where you read the letters. Like I think it's like you can study with a
That's
lawyer
what
and then
he
take the bar.
Then I don't know if you can still do it, but what's the name? the white girl that,
No, wait, what?
she's in law school, no, she's not in law school, she's studying. Jenner, Jenner, what's the name? The father came out gay, the movie star, big money people. Jenner, Chris, what's his name? Chris Jenner?
Kris Jenner,
Kim Kardashian.
the
Kardashian, Kardashian.
Yes, Kim Kardashian,
Kardashian.
studying law.
She's studying, she's not going to law school.
Yeah.
She studied. And John Kennedy went and took the bar 8 times, didn't pass. And
But I
so,
think Virginia is one of the only states.
they
that
still
allows-
do?
I think they still do.
Okay. Tucker
But I
did
think
that.
Virginia is the only one of the only states.
Tucker
that
still,
do that.
yeah, Tucker did that. And went on to become prominent. He did well. You know, he's from Emporia, Virginia, but he practiced out of Richmond, civil rights. But, yeah, it's, now my nephew has, you may see him on the billboards and TV and all that stuff. He has a law firm, he and his wife, in Richmond. Pendleton and Pendleton.
Uh-huh, yeah.
They have a dog and have kids and all that. All that stuff. So they're lawyers, but they didn't do civil rights. See, when I was in school, civil rights was why we went to school.
Mm-hmm. So, when you got out of law school, what kind of law did you think you were gonna practice?
Well, when I was working at Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was formed, I think in 64, 67, I can't remember. And I worked there before Clarence Thomas. I'm trying to think, I can't remember who was the head of that thing. But I worked there for a couple of years. And then I went into consumer law with Esther Peterson and the guy that used to write that book, can't remember his name. And then I went to criminal law for a while until the drug epidemic. I didn't want to represent drug dealers anymore, so I got out of that. And my last few years was in tort practice and estate and family law.
Mm-hmm,
My last few years of practicing.
yeah. It's important.
Yeah.
People need that. Well, what did the effect of MLK denouncing the war in '67 and then his assassination in '68, how did that affect you?
It was a difficult transition for me because he hadn't done much political positions like that before, and I don't think I got the real gist of it until he was killed. And when he was killed, in April, I think it was, of '68, the DC exploded. DC exploded, Huff exploded in Cleveland, Detroit, I can't remember that section, it just exploded, Watts exploded again, Bay Area exploded. And we as students were elected to go down and represent these guys. They were locking up 1,000 people a day. And we were sent down to represent them because they didn't have enough lawyers to do it. And so that's when I got the appreciation for him. And of course I worked, Jesse Jackson was his successor, so to speak. Worked on his campaign. I was general counsel for his campaign, and
Wow.
but he ran for president
Uh-huh.
for the state of Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
I was general counsel there. So that's when I got the picture. But Martin Luther King, when he came out against it, it offended a lot of leaders because it was not a position that black folks usually would take openly like that.
Mm-hmm.
We were more silent protesters on that kind of issue. We were more about civil rights and did not fully understand that this
So
stuff.
it was almost like a distraction from
Well,
what you're trying to accomplish?
No, well, it drew our attention to the fact that this was all interconnected.
Yeah.
It's all interconnected, and it was not benefiting us as a people. It wasn't benefiting us as a people, and by this time Malcolm X is out there, you know, and Black Power with Stokely Carmichael and Featherstone, all those guys, and the bombing in Cambridge, Maryland, that kind of stuff, until Featherstone bombing. You know, by that time, we are now militant. shut it down for like 2 weeks. And they surrounded the campus with marshals. But they didn't open the campus up until they negotiated with us. And at that time, I was working with the vice president of Howard. I was an intern with him. J. Stanton Wormley, who was a Tuskegee Airman, and Colonel Robinson. And so I was working with them at the time, and they understood what was going on because they had been pilots that couldn't go to the cafeteria with white pilots. They were escorted white pilots with the people that wanted planes when they go out on missions and got them back safely. They didn't lose one, but they couldn't go to lunch with them. You know, I don't know if you saw the Soldier Story with Denzel Washington. I can't remember who that was. No, that was, I can't remember. But that's pretty much what it was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they even said, like, in World War II, the black soldiers in Europe faced less racism in Europe while they were serving there. And then it was such a stark contrast when they came back to the U.S.
The black soldiers.
Yeah, and because it was they were allowed more freedoms in
Yeah.
Europe. And then they come back and it's back to the same.
Back to in '57, after the Korean War, when Parker, I think it was in uniform, and that aggravated those people. Tennessee, I think it was. They dragged him off the bus and left him, and the uniform was a target. The uniform was a target. So the guys that went back home in uniform were. It's to say, you may have done all this, but you're still not as good as we are. And so stay in your place, get off the sidewalk when we see us coming down the street, walk down off the sidewalk. And anybody who didn't was, you could be in real serious trouble, yeah.
And then there's Vietnam, where black people are expected, are dying at higher rates. So it's not even, it's not even about freedom, gaining of freedom and then losing freedom.
No.
It's about losing your lives.
That's right. And coming home to the same stuff. And not getting veterans benefits. The white veterans that came home, they used to call it shell shock, but now they call it PSTD.
PTSD, yes.
And they all got disability. I mean, all of them I know got disability. And the blacks were not getting disability because the decisions were being made by the same people in power who had always been in power. And so lately, it's been different. But I had nephews who were wounded and all the PTSD all over the place, were not able to get, and had trouble with the VA. Had trouble with VA benefits. It's getting better now. It's changing now. I guess it's getting better.
It seems like overall the VA is just doing a better job.
A whole lot, yeah. I think since the guy, I can't remember his name, was a paraplegic that was the head of it. Under Carter, maybe? Can't remember. This paraplegic was the head of VA for a while.
What Paige said Brady, could it be Brady? Brady was he was a legislator, wasn't he? Because Brady Law,
Oh, no,
like guns.
that's the other one. Can't remember.
Okay.
That's function of old age.
You remember a lot, though.
Well, I lived a lot of it.
Well, can you talk about like what you think the biggest misconception about the Vietnam War is, from your perspective?
We lost. That's not a misconception. We lost. And Lyndon Johnson did some wonderful things, civil rights. But what killed him was that Vietnam. I think he died from that. He declined to run again, and shortly after died. But I think, I don't know what our interests were. We had already divided Korea, in 49, 1949, 50, 51. Vietnam was already divided, communist and republic, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue. I know it was 2 million people that fought there, 58,000 died, and 24% of them were black. We were 10%, 12% of the population. But that was somewhat of an exit for us also, because jobs were not plentiful.
You said when we talked before this interview that people in your community were going north to get opportunities, right?
Yeah, had the mass exodus. They called that called. It was a name, migration, but it was a name for it. After the 20s, after Tulsa,
Diaspora?
huh?
I think diaspora is the like spreading, like the loss
Yeah, but
of
it was.
but it's not the name.
It's
bigger.
called it was migration something. I can't remember. But yeah, after these people have been to war and come back and still not safe in town and can't vote and all this stuff. It was a mass migration. The South lost probably 40% of the black population. Mississippi still is the highest. I think they maybe 40% black, maybe. Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, where you find majority, the highest proportion of black folks now. But yeah, people from Mississippi went to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. People from West Virginia went to Cleveland, and people from East Coast went to D.C., New York, Philadelphia. And you followed, whichever one went first, brought up the rear, like Harriet Tubman. So when I went to D.C., couldn't rent an apartment, didn't have the money, first of all, and secondly, if they weren't going to rent. My brother went to California after he got out with stripes. He was a first lieutenant. Point Mugu is a Navy military base, and in California, we thought was heaven. Couldn't get a place to live because when they found out he was black, they always said, "Well, we just booked, we just sold, just did it." He had a motorhome, couldn't drive to work because if you saw him driving a motorhome, he'd never get promoted.
Yeah.
So stuff we had to hide, or didn't let people know you had it. Leighton Fairchild was first black, our cousin, first black millionaire. I don't know if in Virginia, but certainly in Spotsylvania. And he had maybe 40, 50 dump trucks. And he bought a Cadillac. I think a Cadillac, yeah. And he put it in the garage, never drove it. And say, when somebody heard that he had it, they came by and tried to peek in his garage. And he knew that if they saw him with a Cadillac, he may not be able to get any more of those contracts. So he didn't do it. The guy that had the first black guy in Spotsylvania to have a Cadillac was named Sam Morris. Couldn't drive it. If you drive it, and he had a beer garden, they call it, where they'd come down, check his license, and see.
So you're saying it would make him a target?
Target. Yeah.
To the white.
Oh yeah.
But it was a status symbol that everybody wanted.
My grandmother was 97 years old when she died, and had been there all her life. And you go into a store at the courthouse, Scott Perry was the name of the store, and she'd walk in and she'd go do a little shopping around the store, and they would say, "Hey, Aunt Nancy," to keep from calling me as white. Aunt Nancy and Aunt. And just before she'd leave, she'd say something like, "I'd sure like to have one of those things over there, but I can't afford it." They said, "Go ahead, Aunt Nancy, you can have it." So she did this little dance.
She played the game.
She knew how to play it. She played them. She played them. My daddy played them. He was a Mason, and there weren't many black Masons around. So he played the judges over town. They were Masons. They knew what a Mason was. There wasn't a black Mason Masonic Hall around there during that time. There was Odd Fellows, which was group of social people, but the Mason was a big thing, you know, coming down from George Washington and those guys. And so my father played that game with them. And that's how we survived. You know, Spotsylvania was a unique place. And I guess it's because we were out of their way, they were out our way. You know, we were 10% of the 13,000, it was 1,300 black folk. And 480 of them were in the school. So the other were grown folks and babies.
Do you have anything that you wish that I would ask you about the Vietnam War or your family's experience in the Vietnam War?
You know, there's a lot I love talking about, but I hate to digress, but there's a guy that died in Spotsylvania, had the funeral last Saturday. He was 100 years old. I've known him all my life, 80 years. And used to go by, I liked his niece that he raised. I liked her, but I was always afraid of him because he didn't do much talk. He didn't do trifling talk. So it wasn't like, you know, you say, how you doing, Mr. Fairchild? He say, that kind of thing. Because I was always a little leery of him. And so one day I was riding down the road and I said, he was up on the roof with a ladder. He was 97. And I got out and I said, Mr. Fairchild, why are you up on that roof? He said, well, there was a leak up here and the roof wasn't coming down. So I went up. I said, okay. So they had this big article in the Freelance Star about him. He had been to South Korea, Philippines, all this other stuff during the war.
What was his full name?
Samuel Braxton. I didn't bring his obituary. Google him on Found and Son at the party. And so I went by and I saw him after he had his name and an article in the paper. I said, how come you never told anybody about this stuff? He said, nobody ever asked me. So the best story in our neighborhood are from questions not asked. And so I only know how to respond. Because there's just so much stuff, so much stuff that I've seen, and I'm disturbed more today about it than I was then, I think, because our community was closer.
And now it's
We were closer.
Yeah.
And we were more supportive.
Well, I mean, it's also, you know, like we had like the interstate system, like that ruined a lot of black communities.
Gone.
Yeah.
What's this bottom over here called?
The
Shaka Bottom or something? My people came out of there. You know, and when they put 95 through, right through the middle, 64 right through the middle. Chicago, same thing, Michigan Avenue right through the middle. You know.
Yeah.
Because we had no people on there. Just look, if you ever get a chance, go to Fredericksburg. It's the most beautiful place you'll ever go, except they have allowed people with money to infuse the area with grift. I mean, stuff everywhere. VA there, all this stuff, they just put a new VA there. All this stuff emptying onto a two-lane highway, two-lane road. Just insane. They're putting this, to get from Springfield to Fredericksburg is $27.
Oh, yeah.
Toll.
The HOV.
Yeah. Toll. And then you don't save a whole lot of time because when you get to the end of it, the bound breaks. And so they're letting this stuff happen as if there's no reason to be concerned about tomorrow. You know, the flooding and all this other stuff that people are denying.
The climate change.
Yeah. I don't know. I think if I were younger, I'd be more desperate. But you know, I am concerned about my kids and grandkids.
When did you get married? Did you get married?
Oh yeah, 1969. And so my kids my oldest is 60.
So what was your wife's name?
Well, I've married twice.
Okay.
First wife was Fanny. She was from Lawrenceville. Her name was Diane. She was from Lawrenceville, teacher, master.
So did you meet at while you were in school?
In Maryland. We moved.
Okay.
I was in law school when I got married the first time.
Okay.
And then we separated. She died a couple months ago.
I'm sorry.
So I had two kids from that marriage, and my last marriage was in 2000, was 1996. So we've been together since 2006, 1996.
What's her name?
Gwen,
Gwen.
yeah, she was from Fredericksburg. Her family was the most prominent black family probably in Fredericksburg. They were Bumbrys. They came up with that plantation down in
Can you spell that?
Bumbrey.
Okay.
And it was 18 of them, aunts and uncles, and she had 43 first cousins, and all of them came out of APL. That was military base in Caroline, Essex County area, King George. And when the Army took that land from black folk down there, they all moved to Fredericksburg, to a place called Mayfield. And the rest of them moved to a place called Slabtown. And it was named Slabtown because they built those homes there with slabs. You may not know what a slab is.
And on the slab, yeah, concrete slab.
No,
No?
it's a shaving of a tree.
Oh, okay.
You know, when they make square posts, they cut the round parts
The
off.
round, yeah,
Those pieces are called slabs.
okay.
They threw those away. So people took those and built homes. It was like 18 of them in the country. There was one in Spotsylvania, a couple of them in Atlanta, I think. I think it's only maybe, when they gentrified, they changed the name to Lee Hill. Used to be Slabtown. And nobody knows what it is anymore because those people are dead. But we had a strong community. Black folks had a strong community. We suffered through a lot of stuff together, but God, were we strong
Yeah.
and helpful of each other, not envious of each other, trusting of each other. And the authority came from the elderly, the older people. They were the authority.
In the church, like.
The home, church, and the neighborhood. You know, and teachers were our neighbors. They went to, they couldn't get an apartment or because the principal wouldn't let them live as single women in a place. They stayed in homes with families.
They rented rooms.
They were, yeah, they had red rooms.
Borders.
Yeah, keep them pure. My third grade teacher was living with the old. She would have been 27 years only married. Her husband was teaching in Fairfax in Alexandria, and she was teaching in Spotsylvania. So on weekends, he'd catch a bus down, and the bus would stop in front of her, a Greyhound bus, and they'd catch her, go to Richmond to get a room or something for the weekend.
Oh, my goodness.
Because he couldn't stay at the house with the guy that was renting to him said, no couples gonna sleep, no couples, married or unmarried, not even there in my house. And so, but we had an ethic also, and it was a good thing. And frankly, see, the integration didn't do what it was supposed to do. I don't think so. And I'm so glad, I'm proud of having been reared in a segregated environment. Because the only thing integration was supposed to do was give us equal rights. That's all I wanted. I didn't need nobody to marry. Yeah. In fact, it was a point. I say I don't need nobody to marry, and I think you ought to know. I just want the right to go to the place you go. That's it. You know, I want to sit on the front of the bus. I want to.
You wanted to vote.
So you don't have to be worried about me taking anything you got.
Yeah.
Just give me a right to change violence. Say, open the door. That's all we were supposed to do. And we lost it. Our community lost it. But I'm glad to see you taking an interest in this. How does this focus? Your focus is on just the Vietnam War.
We are, but you are very interesting. So everything you tell me is, I think we want that information just in our archive of, you know, people's experiences in segregation and living in Virginia. So yes, we are a little off topic, but
Oh, I'm sorry. I
it's
told you to keep me focused.
but no, I don't think that any.
Don't keep me focused.
Because I mean, to me, it's kind of like segregation is such a foreign concept to people of my generation. It's like we can't even conceive of it, that it was something that you did. And I think it's important to make people realize, like, yes, America is a wonderful country. It has a lot of wonderful attributes, but we have done some crazy things for the sense of hierarchy. And, we have to make sure that we don't backslide, that, and that we continue moving forward equality to people because the job's not done.
My question would be, why would you not want people to know that this happened? Why would you not want people to know? There's a move afoot, as you know. Why would you not want people to know? These are books you wrote, and stuff I would have put in, you didn't put in, but at least let them read stuff you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you don't want to do that? My grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mother was second generation out of slavery in Spotsylvania County. My grandmother, first generation. Her husband was in slavery, and every one of her uncles were slaves.
Yeah, I mean, and that's very close.
Why
We're
not me?
so close.
Why you don't want people to know that?
Yeah.
That you had slavery? Why you don't want to know that Kennecoute was the roots, and it lived on the plantation next to where we live. The judge say he's buried on his property up there. Why you don't want people to know that they cut his foot off? I mean, why you don't want people to know this stuff? I mean, if it's a lie, don't let them know. But if it's true, why not?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't know, based on what you just said. They can't fathom. Can't fathom. The stuff that has been seen. And these are young guys here. There's a guy up there in Spotsylvania named John Parker. He's 101, I think. The stuff they've seen.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was born in 1894. My grandmother was born in 1873. Her husband born in 1865. The year. And all of her uncles prior to that. And there's a picture of Fredericksburg in 1939 at a church called Shiloh Old Site. And there are 30-some ex-slaves standing in front of the building. 1939. The last slave was sold on the block that they're fighting over up there, slave block in Fredericksburg. The last slave sold there was a Crutchfield. Distant cousin.
Mm-hmm.
Why you don't want people to know that? They're fighting over a concrete block. And I want people to know this happened. Emmett Till ain't no joke. So unless they know, they won't believe.
And they won't try to
No.
fix
Yeah.
what still needs to be fixed.
There's a whole bunch of stuff still needs to be fixed. But the truth is, there ain't been a war we ain't been in. Yeah.
You said that you had Civil War that.
My great-grandfather, my mother's great-grandfather was in the Civil War.
Do you know his name?
Henry White.
Uh-huh.
There's a memorial on Vermont Avenue in D.C. And it got the names of the Virginia soldiers who were in the war. And his name is on there. My father was in the Second World War, and my brothers were Korea
In Vietnam.
and Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you definitely have the history of service in the family.
Oh yeah. My first cousins in Second World War. All of them in Second World War. So we fought. We had to fight from the rear, most of them. Because we were doing menial jobs, and yet the Tuskegee Airmen were the most notorious flyers in the world. In fact, they got this weekend, of Culpeper or Manassas. They got the Tuskegee Airmen exhibit of museum or something.
Oh,
That's it's up there until Saturday. Uh, but if you there's a Tuskegee Museum at Tuskegee, then there's a Slave Museum at Montgomery. All those places, you know,
Yeah.
go there and read that stuff. People that were lynched in Richmond. You know, it's a lot of, but people don't seem to be interested in past that much. You know, not careful, repeat itself.
well, it was interesting. We had a person in last week who was he was an activist. He was a white activist against an anti-war activist, but he also was involved in Civil War activism. Yeah, not Civil War, civil rights, excuse me. And there were so many parallels to Black Lives Matter protests and what he went through in civil rights / Vietnam War protests. So it was almost kind of like repeating, you know, like history was repeating itself in those moments. Just have to keep hoping that we learn the lesson.
But you know, I say this, I don't know if this should be on camera, you can cut it out. But had it not been for good white people, we wouldn't be where we are. We'd be worse off. A whole bunch of good white people. You know, even now, Black Lives Matter. That's those people getting beat up out there, white people. You know, and so that ought to be acknowledged.
I think it takes everyone. It takes everyone.
Yeah, that ought to be acknowledged because they are good people. You know, you still got Boonesville, Mississippi. You know, it's just, but there are good people in the world.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
people.
Well, do you guys have any questions for Mr. Dyson?
I was just gonna say it was called the Great Migration.
Yeah.
Yeah, Great Migration, and then the head of the Veterans Administration was Joseph Maxwell Cleland.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's it. That's it.
Thank you, Google.
This thing has caused us to be dumb. Because we could have fought this in our head if we had. We ain't got time. Just Google it. That's it. Yeah, that's it. He was. Yeah, that's where it became more sensitive with him.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I could sit here all day.
But I don't know if you've seen those articles in the Freelance Star about him. Have you?
about your brother.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I think I got some things off of the internet about him, you know, like
They've done 4 stories on him since 2014. And finally, you know, here's another thing. You can go in any community and ask a kid what was the black high school here in Richmond? Where are you from? Oh,
Danny.
where are you from?
I'm from Florida.
What part? What part?
South Florida, but
What-
my grandmother was from Georgia and
No, but South Florida is not a town.
Fort Lauderdale.
Oh, yeah, I just left, my grandkids were playing at Jackie Robinson Stadium in Vero Beach.
Yes,
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
You know about Okokee?
I'm a bad Floridian.
You don't know about Okokee? That's the town they burned.
Oh, yes.
And it's not, yeah, it burned that town in Okokee. Same year they burned the one in Oklahoma,
Right, exactly.
21. And I think 200 people were killed in Okokee. And there was a movie, what was that movie? Don Cheadle was in it.
Oh, yes.
Homewood, Rosewood.
Rose.
Rosewood was based loosely on that. But, I mean,
So
the
you're saying
wealth,
there are examples everywhere of this?
the life and the wealth and the knowledge. Can you imagine if they had kept all those black brains in Mississippi? Just the brains. You know, if we could use all the brains we have, couldn't be harmful.
No.
And we won't need them soon because AI is going to take all that. Won't need them. But I really appreciate the opportunity. I just get so emotionally involved in the conversation that I lose train of thought.
You're doing great. Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
But that picture there shows you the color, yeah. That shows you, he was DJ on the radio in Fredericksburg, first Herman Griffin's on the radio now as as a sports guy. That's him at Boyd's School of
That's his
Business.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's him at Boyd's School of Business.
yeah.
And that's him with the baseball team. And that's him when he was sworn in. And that's him in his military. He had about 6 or 7 medals
Mm-hmm.
from the war. Yeah,
The next difference, yeah.
from the war. But I really appreciate you taking the time. Gaylord Sims has done a tremendous job in Fredericksburg. Stuff's going on there I never thought could happen, because if you follow that scenario in Spotsylvania County with the school board, you think that the South has risen again, and she's brought that crew that's there now is sensitizing people to all the issues in a way that's respectful, but true. But if you watch the school board, you'd think they're all nuts. I spoke there last fall.
What did you say?
Well, they wanted to ban the books. And I asked them about the Bible, you want to ban the Bible and all that stuff. Because you got homosexuality, you got whoredom, you got slaves, you got all that stuff in there, in the Bible. And the truth is that most of these people are not natives. I mean, they ain't natives. What I wanted to know is where the venom came from. Because white folks probably didn't like me then, a lot of them. And I liked them, but the venom wasn't obvious. The only time I recall there it being any interracial stuff was a movie called Pinky, 1951, came out. And it was Pinky, P-I-N-K-Y. And I can't remember because you sneaked to watch it because it was a movie that kids weren't supposed to see. And it was a little mini riot after that because apparently there was one called, Pinky was about a white girl. I think she may have been passing, a black girl may have been passing for white. Imitation of Life was the other one. You might have had Esther Waters and Ethel Waters, Imitation of Life. Those are 2 classic movies. But Pinky is the only time I recall any conflict between white and blacks. It had in Fredericksburg.
In Fredericksburg.
Yeah, and that lasted probably a month.
So what about the movie?
The movie?
What about the movie made people feel like they're going to have a conflict?
I don't know if I know in Imitation of Life, the black girl mother was black, her father was white, and she was so light you couldn't tell the difference. But she didn't want to acknowledge her mother, who was this maid. She hung out with the woman that was her mother's employer as a maid, and her daughter, who was obviously white. So everybody thought she was white. And so she went places where they went, passing as white. And when they discovered that she wasn't white, then there was conflict. I don't know if they beat her up or I can't remember the story on that one. That's on Imitation of Life. Now, Pinky, I think it might have been, black guy might have a relationship or something wouldn't have been,
Interracial?
no, it wouldn't have been a relationship, because they didn't, you know, and guess who coming to dinner?
Yeah.
They didn't even kiss her.
Yeah.
It's just lately, and Denzel Washington refused to kiss in that other movie. So that, I don't recall Jim Brown was in that one with Sophia Loren, but that I don't recall any intimacy in any of those movies. So I don't know what it was, but I remember I remember there being
You remember
conflict.
that there was
Yeah,
conflict.
I remember conflict. I would have been 9 at the time. I remember conflict of that.